Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of A Manic Odyssey. I'm your host, Stefan, and with me today I have an incredible guest, Jesse Finkelstein. Jesse is the inventor of the game of real life. Be mindful, solve conflicts, gain points, live better. He is the co-founder of TheraHive, and he's a clinical psychologist and DBT therapist. Hey, Jesse.
Hey, how's it going?
Oh my gosh, so great. I'm so glad that our paths crossed and that I get to have you on the podcast. First of all, just kind of tell me who the heck is Jesse Finkelstein and how do we know each other?
Oh my gosh. Who is Jesse Finkel? Okay, so as you mentioned, I am a licensed psychologist, a DBT therapist, and a co-founder at TheraHive. I'm also an instructor in clinical psychology at Columbia University, which is where I do a lot of my day work. And you and I met each other through TheraHive. And by me also being a fan of your work that you do broadly.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know you were did you say a professor, an adjunct professor at Columbia?
I'm an instructor. So basically what that means is I am a clinical psychologist at Columbia Psychiatry has an intensive outpatient program. So I work there leading as a psychologist there essentially.
Amazing. And then how did you stumble into DBT? Because you are a clinical psychologist first. So then what led to the DBT specific?
DBT stuff. So this is a great question. So I am one of those like mid-career people. Essentially, I went back to school at 35 for clinical psychology. And at the time, I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about DBT.
Yeah.
And I actually wasn't a huge fan of cognitive behavioral therapy. All of
Hmm.
my experience as a consumer of therapy had been in psychodynamic, psychoanalytic world. And that's
Yeah.
what I thought I was going back to school for.
Yeah.
And my first year in graduate school, I had Dr. Shireen Rizvi, who was was mentored by Marshall Lenehan, the developer of DBT. And she sort of changed my career trajectory. Like the way that she talked about CBT and the way that she talked about DBT, it sort of brought all the things that I was interested in psychology together.
Hmm.
And I was like, oh, this makes sense to me. This is the work that I want to do. So it was really by virtue of her sort of instruction and teaching that I was like, that I arrived at wanting to do CBT and then wanting to do DBT specifically.
I love that. Since DBT is so much about radically accepting where we're at and then deciding if we want to stay or change or some mixture of the two, can you walk me through what it was like to have a mid-career shift and what kind of, if you want to share what led to that process? Because so
Yeah,
much of my generation, especially, and of course this generation behind us, feels like there isn't as much flexibility, like find your niche, stick to your niche, and then that's your life for the rest of your life. And I don't get to hear a lot of stories about people pivoting and changing their career plans and what that felt like.
that makes me like I hope like I so I if we're going to talk about ages, what I'm 43. Wait, how old are you?
You're 43? Oh my goodness. I say that as a high compliment, not as like an observational judgment. No, the I'm 31.
Mhm.
I'm just a
So
bit.
it's interesting. Like I work with a lot of folks who are like 35 and younger.
Hmm.
And I'm always because I, I feel like the whole thing about like your generation is like the idea that you're going to have multiple careers. Like this idea that you were going to work at one company for the rest of your life
Yeah.
was like this was antiquated. And I thought like your generation. And so I don't know. I wish that for everyone. I mean, unless you find a job that you love and you want to be in it forever, congratulations. For
Yeah.
me, I was doing design stuff. I was doing sort of tech stuff prior to coming to psychology. And I remember sort of waking up every day and just thinking like, oh, I should be doing something different. I was just
Mm.
like, and it wasn't. an unhappiness that was so profound that I felt driven to figure something out.
Hmm.
It was like things were good enough, but there were certain signs that in retrospect I should have perhaps paid attention to.
Yeah.
So, for instance, like feelings of envy. Like I would look at what other people were doing and I would be like, I want that job, or
Mm.
I'm envious of what they're doing.
Yeah.
And so it was just a constant feeling of like, of never doing enough or never feeling proud of what I was doing. And then the other thing that I experienced a lot was regret. Like I would look at like sort of forks in the road of my life and be like, oh, only if I had taken that other road, things would have been better.
Mm.
And I never registered those thoughts and those emotions as me living in congruence with my values.
Hmm.
Like I never thought like, oh, experiences of regret, experiences of envy were signs that, hey, I was not working towards my life worth living goals.
Yeah.
I just thought this was my life and whatever, it was good enough. And yeah.
Yeah. Totally.
Um, so what ended changing all of that is truly like 2016 came around. It was a major election for those who remember,
Hmm.
and not unlike an election that we had recently. And I, the stakes somehow felt different.
Yeah.
And I want to recognize that for many folks, the stakes have always been huge.
Hmm.
And I occupy a place of privilege where I could be to some extent insulated from some of those stakes.
Yeah.
And with 2016, everything felt much more immediate. And it felt like, well, oh, fuck. Like, can I curse on this?
Please do.
Okay. I was like, oh, fuck. Like, I want my, I don't know, I want to be of more service.
Mm. Yeah.
And that's when I decided to go back to school for psychology. I lucked out because I don't, it could have gone any other which way. Like, who knows if like it was a real, sure, like I just remember announcing to a group of friends one night over dinner, be like, I'm going to become a psychologist. And everyone was like, yeah, sure. You know, it's like the things that, like, I'm going to write a book or I'm
Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
like, sure, like that sounds great. And then the
Yeah.
next thing I know, I'm like, and fortunately, it is for me the most wonderful perfect like I can't say how like I love this work so much and I feel so lucky.
Yeah.
And what is remarkable, and it here's like I will say this as just sort of a tangent, which is I just find so interesting, which is like these persistent thoughts of regret
Yeah.
or envy that like really, and I think of a lot, thoughts I think of as behaviors. So like these were habitual thoughts,
Yeah.
right? Like thoughts that I would frequently engage in, like, oh, I should be doing something else. Oh, I regret that I didn't take path B. All of that went away when I went to graduate school. Like all
Wow.
of that experience, like those thoughts, I no longer experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that.
It's such a like I can't tell you the last time I've really experienced envy. Like
Mm.
it's a real thing.
So, okay, this is so. Wait, real quick. We're gonna come back to this. I want to
Yes.
real quick go back and say to my comment about like, oh, like sticky. You have to stick with one career. I think with this generation and with the generation below me, it's this pendulum has swung kind of too far in the other direction.
Mm.
Where instead of there being one thing that I find value in, and then other things that are my hobbies that bring me value, it's well, what's your hustle on top of your niche on top of your career? And it's like, well, I'm burnt out. Well, but you're doing the thing you're supposed to be doing, right? You're not sticking to one career like your grandpa. That was boring. But now you're a author, gardener, podcaster. And it's like, well, which of these things? And so for me, right, like I just kind of I'm continue on my exploration of who I am and who I can be. And in my kind of internal process, I'm slowly realizing that giving myself permission to not be one thing while radically accepting I live in a world where one of those things making money will help me get to my life worth living goals is a lot better than being like, oh, I'm all of these things all of the time. Like the things that I do well that I love, that bring me joy, writing, performing, having conversations with people, being creative. Like those are the things that, regardless of what I'm doing, bring me joy. The challenge is which of those things am I going to now, in my personal opinion, poison a little bit with, oh, it's my living. It's, it has to make me money. So like that's what I mean with like the
That's
balance.
that. God, this is one of the moments where I do have to say, like, I feel lucky that I'm a little older because I feel like to some extent, like I bypassed like a hair's breadth, sort
Yeah.
of the influencer economy.
Yeah.
And it really, do you mind if we like go on a tangent for a
Please.
second?
This
Because
is yeah, this is an
like
open space. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
what I think about is sort of like the relationship that we have to work.
Hmm.
Like, you know, for a long time, like it's like at one point, like your work was your life.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden you had HR sort of as a like an organization emerge because
Hmm.
now we had to make sure that or like companies had to make sure they were not just managing sort of like your work and your productivity, but now they really wanted your well-being and like your like identity. Like work had to be part of your life,
Yeah.
had to be one of your reasons for living
Yep.
in order for you to continue working at these places.
Right.
And now, to your point, like the pendulum has swung in such a direction where it's like now work, it's like people have talked about this in far more eloquent ways than I have. All of that's to say is that like, I mean, capitalism sucks, man. Like,
It really
I
does.
just like it just the way that like capital infiltrates identity and work in all sorts of fucked up ways.
Yeah.
That's my thank you.
No,
Okay.
good. Yes, that soapbox is welcomed anytime because,
Thank you. I appreciate
um,
that.
like I'm very fortunate to have a dad who w wants to have those conversations with me when I say capitalism sucks, right? He wants to be like, well, why does it suck? And I get to go, well, here's why I think it sucks. And he goes, well, what would you do to change it? And I get to go, here's what I think why would you do to change it? And he would go, well, that doesn't work because of this, this, and this. And I go, okay, right. So I'm lucky in that way where I get to have a kind of a sounding board of someone who is staunchly capitalistic and just across the board. And I get to kind of throw stuff at the wall and be like, well, is this going to stick? Is this going to stick? And what's funny is we found common ground on a few things. The big thing that we find common ground on is medicine. I
Hmm.
have gotten really both my parents to be like, socialized medicine isn't such a bad idea, right? Because even them who are in like the middle to upper echelon of like kind of the financial pendulum that's constantly swinging for, the mythical middle class, they struggle as well. And like they have those moments of financial stress. And like, so seeing them, I think them having those experiences doesn't turn them off to the possibility of like shaking it up a bit. So yeah, I agree with you on that. And like as we explore identity, right? Like I think I've shared with you, right? Like what I'm passionate about is, and what I think I could maybe do potentially for the rest of my life is just be someone who asks questions about things that we're kind of taking for granted, right?
Hmm.
Like this idea right now that, with the pendulum swung, very far, understandably during the Me Too movement because it had to, because it was so far the other way. Now it's
Hmm.
kind of coming back to the middle, but I don't particularly feel like we've done as much work as we could have done in that time period to like come to more of an equilibrium with the sexes across the board. It still feels like we pushed really hard for reform. I don't know how hard that reform actually stuck, given like a few articles that came out after the Me Too movement where it was like, hey, shit's still happening. Don't forget that this shit's still happening. And it left, as we just saw with the last election, it left a lot of people feeling a lot of males and male identifiers or masculine identifying people feeling disenfranchised, which is just such a odd thing to notice during like the world cycle. Given, I think I told you that like some world agency just released the most recent statistics on femicides nationwide or worldwide, and the numbers were still pretty steady, and in some places going up. So it isn't that. To me, the problem is that we have half the world's population don't know how to regulate their emotions, and they're being told that it's the other half's fault. To me, DBT is like the perfect little antidote to come in and be like, actually, dialectically speaking, here you're both suffering, and you're both suffering because of X, Y, and Z. Here's what you can do to change your life, or just not change your life and stay as you are, continue to suffer. Um, you
It's
brought up. Oh, go ahead.
No, no, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, I just circling back, you said something really profound that actually came up in my group the other night, which is in some of the meditations, which shoot, I forgot to make a note of this to Roland. So I'll make a note of this and let Roland know. But in some of the meditations, it says positive and negative emotions. And I
Yeah.
tell my group all the time, there is no such thing as positive and negative emotions. There's emotions that lead you towards helpful and unhelpful or destructive and self-destructive, whatever behaviors. And you said that envy was a great indicator of that your life was not on track with your life worth living goals. As someone who grew up in a deeply religious and dogmatic environment, hearing a word like envy is like that's one of the seven deadly sins. Like that's a big bad negative emotion that's only going to lead you away from the life you want to be living. And I heard you say envy was an important marker and something to pay attention to that got you back on track. Can you like dive into that with me? Like what was that relationship to something that's socially seen as like a quote unquote bad emotion?
It's funny. It really is. And I kind of really enjoy talking about my experience of envy for that reason, because I feel like it's an emotion that I think for the reason that you just described, like associate lots of feelings of shame, like we need
Hmm.
to be embarrassed. And yet, like, whatever, our economy is built on envy.
Yep.
I think for me, I never experienced my envy as something to be ashamed of. Like it was never like, oh, I'm experiencing envy, so I'm a bad person.
Mm.
Most part, I don't think I really ever thought of my like I never really held to ideas of good or bad for people. So I think that always sort of made me somewhat of a behaviorist to start with. But
Yeah, a little
regardless,
bit.
like I think for me, the function of envy is I think of it almost as avoidance.
Hmm.
So here's my thought, which is that envy, not unlike rumination, I think what it does is allow us to briefly escape into a fantasy
Hmm.
of what life could be like,
Hmm.
which in that escape, we find some measure of relief
Hmm.
from maybe the disappointment, the grief, the sadness that life is not what we want it to be now.
Yeah.
It's like I can, for a brief moment, imagine myself living a different life.
Yeah.
And in that brief moment, I get like a little hit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think I even back then sort of understood that the envy served a function. Now, I think to your point, for me, the reason why that's a marker is because I think any behavior that serves as a way of avoiding or coming to contact with reality, with what I'm feeling,
Mm.
tends to be a marker that I'm moving away from something and not towards something. Does that make
Mm.
sense? I'm
Yes.
happy to explain what I mean by
Yeah. Well, please, well, elaborate, please. What do you mean?
that. I do I really I do like this sort of like the tool slash metaphor that, and we actually adapted this in TheraHive when we discussed the DBT skill of effectively.
Hmm.
But the sort of ACT therapist Russ Harris has, and I imagine he collaborated with some other psychologists as well on this tool called a choice point.
Mm.
And so, like at any given moment, when confronted by a situation, we can move in one of two directions. Like, if I see someone who I think has a better career than I do,
Hmm.
and all of a sudden I am filled with envy in that moment, I can move away, meaning I can get hooked on those envy thoughts.
Hmm.
And maybe that would cause me to avoid that person. Maybe it would cause me to feel shame or regret. And then I may want to have the urge to hide in my apartment or to give up, not do things that are important to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's sort of moving away.
Yeah.
Alternatively, I can recognize that there's this experience of envy and say, like, okay, like that's an envy thought.
Yeah.
And hold in mind, like the things that are important to me,
Yeah.
values like being connected with people, being creative, etc. And so at that moment, I can move towards something.
Yeah.
So instead of trying to escape the envy, instead of trying to avoid it, I can recognize it, acknowledge it, and continue to do the things that are important to me, irrespective of its presence.
Yeah.
So I think that looking back at like sort of that period of my life, I was engaged in a lot of away behaviors.
Mm.
I was experiencing, I think, a lot of like grief, but also like shame
Yeah.
around sort of choices I had made, which caused me to at times like avoid taking risks,
Mm.
avoid trying new things.
Yeah.
And so I was making a lot of towards moves. I was just making lots of away moves.
I love that. I love that. You said something earlier about growing up and not having kind of the binary of good and bad. Were you raised religious?
Um, was I like, so I was raised, I guess to some extent, like culturally Jewish, and I was exposed to like religious elements of Judaism. I never, I never really sort of. I think there was a couple of things. One, like as a queer gay man, like it. I never felt like there was a real natural space for me, at least in that time in Judaism. Like
Yeah.
I imagine maybe things have changed a lot where it feels, but I always felt like a bit of an outsider. So it was always easy for me to be fuck this. I'm not gonna buy, like I'm not buying into this.
Yeah.
And I that position early on led me to feel somewhat skeptical of those binaries of, but also Judaism doesn't really, for the most part, present, I think, unlike some religions, like that binary of good and bad.
Yeah.
It's a very, it's everything's very complicated, which is one of the things I appreciate about it as like an intellectual,
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah. No, yeah, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. Cool. Yeah, I was just curious because it's not a common experience to kind of grow up without those, right? That
Yeah.
that judgmental dogma. And definitely something within your, natural makeup that didn't cling on to some of those things because I know a lot of people, myself included, who, didn't just drink the Kool-Aid, like chugged the Kool-Aid and then remade the Kool-Aid and drank it as many times as you could because your life
Do you
depended on it, literally.
like you still like do you find yourself at times like fighting against the urge of like judging things good or bad, or judging yourself as good or bad?
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah, I think that's why it's a lot less effort for me to put myself in the shoes of some of these students that we work with is because when they say a self-judgment or they invalidate themselves on the spot, live, I so recognize what that feels like and what it would be like to say it in a group setting because I've done it a million times. It,
Yeah.
it's it is really, really, really understated, and I don't even honestly know how well researched it is, the stickiness and the longevity of that stickiness of those old ideas. It's a lot
Yeah.
less like a flesh wound and more like a bone marrow transplant that's
Mm.
slowly happening over and over and over again. I went to a private Christian university. I grew up Christian my entire life. The joke, with my parents, they didn't expect me to go to a private Christian college and come out atheist, but hey, that's sometimes the way the cookie crumbles. Um, and prior to getting the diagnosis of BPD, though, I personally have worked through quite a few of those behaviors. So it's an interesting diagnosis because you don't always continue to hit the markers as you're kind of healing through some of the more dangerous and destructive ones. And I would say that I still identify as someone with borderline personality disorder because it just is a helpful guide map and roadmap for me to keep working from. And I think it keeps me honest about what are the pitfalls, what are the behavioral pitfalls that I need to be mindful of, or that I get to be mindful of, knowing what the diagnosis can and can't give. That's my perspective on it. I don't feel like diagnoses are necessarily like the end all be all, and they can be really helpful jumping off points, essentially.
It's interesting what you mentioned a moment ago about like how sort of your capacity to empathize with folks who relate, like who communicate those judgment thoughts, because I do find myself like it this is, and I think this is a good example of both like where a skill reveals a skills deficit.
Hmm.
So I think I am particularly skilled at being non-judgmental.
Mm.
And so I do think in some ways that makes me an effective therapist, in that for the most part, anyone could say anything. And I think what I would like to believe is that I communicate to them, fine, like, like I'm not gonna judge you. Like, let's
Yeah.
talk about
Yeah.
it. And I think the skills deficit is that I don't always, or I have difficulty at times relating to that experience of shame
Mm.
when they identify themselves as bad.
Hmm.
And I've noticed at times almost like an experience of impatience. And I've actually said to clients before, like, I wish I could just go into your brain and take out the judgment.
Yeah.
Like, I wish I could take that out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's I don't know, it's an interesting, I appreciate that you brought that up, because I've never thought about it in those terms before.
Yes. Well, you have a bit of a leg up on the competition in regards to the dialectical mindset, only because what you've shared already, right? You grew up in Judaism, but you didn't really buy into it 100%. That's kind of a dialectical choice, even at a young age. Seeing it, not judging it, and also not participating. You also identify as a queer gay man. That puts you in the dialectical experience of being a human male, right? You are both experiencing something that is common and something that's uncommon at the exact same time, right? So I'm wondering, like, those experiences, they give you so many tools. Like, what do you bring into the therapeutic setting, like with your clients, and even just like as you guys have continued to build TheraHive, like Jesse's personal experiences in these spaces, how does that show up?
I Firstly, that's just an interesting observation. Like, I've never thought of how identities inform our experience of dialectics, and how, like, yeah, being a cis man but being gay,
Hmm.
so being at once inside and outside at times,
Hmm.
it's sort of this experience of moving between various states of truth or reality, and having to integrate it and to arrive at some sort of synthesis. It's a really interesting. I just want to note that I love sort of that conceptualization. I think that, I think that there's a bit of synthesis that needed to happen that got me to TheraHive, in that when I arrived in graduate school, I really thought that, like, my illustration, art, design, tech background was done.
Hmm.
That I was going to be a psychologist and that was it.
Yeah.
And what I have found is that the greatest impact I feel like I've made within, let's say, the DBT community, and with TheraHive, has been at synthesizing
Hmm.
my skills as a clinician and as a designer.
Hmm.
In that I think psychologists are great at developing treatments that work, and psychologists aren't necessarily great at making those treatments legible slash desirable for
Hmm.
people to use.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, that's sort of the synthesis that I have sort of brought, like, integrating these two different experiences.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's, like, I think for me, like, TheraHive has been such a beautiful outlet for me to do that.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And it's unique in that I think what I love most about TheraHive is that it doesn't try to pretend that it's therapy. It very openly says, "Hey, this is psychoeducation. We put the ball in your court. We're here to support you as you dribble it, but we're not going to be the ones that teach you how to play, essentially." And I was very grateful to discover TheraHive because I am at current not interested in going back to school, mostly just like monetary reasons. Like I still have my undergrad that I have to pay off, and that's cool. So what I love about it is that it gives me opportunities to keep the skills top of mind. That was my goal when I finished DBT, was to just no matter what, keep the skills top of mind. That's why my content changed. And I'm about to kind of swing a little more back to social political topics through a DBT lens, right? So I have this kind of like odd, eclectic, dysregulated, undiagnosed amount of content that you can go and look at whenever you want as an example of like, wow, this person is dysregulated to a little more, nuance, to a little more dialectics, to like now I'm kind of coming back to based on it being like, okay, well, like what have we learned on this journey? And like after all of this time spending and thinking about dialectics, what can we bring to the conversation? Because the passion hasn't changed, right? My passion remains the same. I want to give men the tools so they don't keep hurting the people around them. I am a firm believer that we as human beings have the ability to change, and that neuroplasticity of our brain is the best discovery we've ever discovered because it gives people the ability to know, man, I am super stuck and I know I can change, in given the nuance of certain circumstances. So, yeah, I love TheraHive. I love what DBT has done. For me, what has been kind of the most impactful part of DBT coming into your life as a practicing therapist? Like, not you can either speak to personally, like what has started for you, maybe interpersonally or emotionally, or just in your day to day as you interact with clients and interact with the world at large.
It's hard for me to even identify one thing. It has transformed me as a person. Um, I, uh, I would say there are a couple things that really stand out. I think that, DBT is an emotion focused treatment in that we conceptualize emotions as being some of the most powerful sort of prompts for behaviors.
Hmm.
So emotions tend to drive a lot of behaviors.
Hmm.
And the urge to escape emotion,
Hmm.
avoid emotion, numb emotion,
Hmm.
oftentimes can lead to ineffective behaviors.
Yeah.
So I think for myself, developing tools to tolerate, accept, even learn to love unwanted emotions. And I'm really glad that you sort of highlighted like positive and negative. There's no such thing. Unwanted in some cases,
Yeah, totally.
emotions that feel really uncomfortable.
Hmm.
So having the skills to tolerate that has been frankly transformative. I don't like as kids, we're not taught how to be with emotions.
Hmm.
And so through DBT, I learned how to be with my emotions. Um, so I think that's one thing that comes to mind. I think the other thing that comes to mind, yeah, I think the aspects of the treatment, you said this, like, and oh gosh, I forget. I believe I think she's at Stony Brook, a psychologist who develops like this sort of this change mindset intervention,
Yeah.
which has like apparently profound impact. Like one session can have a really profound impact. And
Hmm.
essentially what the entire intervention communicates is that you can change.
Mm.
Our plans are not fixed.
Yeah.
And I think for me to hear that and to see it and to know it and to communicate that to others is truly profound.
Yeah.
Because I think for many of us, we arrive, and I struggle with this myself, with thoughts that were somehow intrinsically bad,
Yeah.
broken,
Yeah.
um, you know, quote unquote, like crazy. Like there's something intrinsically in our soul
Yeah.
unchangeably deficient.
Yeah.
And what DBT teaches us is that's not, there's no evidence behind that. None of us is one thing.
Yeah.
Who we are, how we behave is oftentimes it's contextual.
Totally.
So the way that I'm with you right now is probably not the same way that I would behave if I was standing waiting to get at, I don't know, online at Trader Joe's.
Yeah.
Like who we are exists in our environment, so it's transactional. And who we are is always changing. Change is the only constant.
Yeah.
The person that was speaking a moment ago is not the same person that's speaking right now.
Yeah.
Cells have died in my body, new cells have been born, new neurons have fired.
Yeah.
I am not the same person.
Yeah. I
And I
love
think
that.
it's helpful to, I don't know, to live in that.
Yeah. How do you live in that kind of on a day to day? That sounds very healthy. And I'm wondering what like practically that could look like.
I think day to day, I think that for me, like sometimes I have those thoughts like there's certain aspects of me that I assume or believe are like I'm like, oh, like some sort of switch just doesn't work in my brain.
Yeah.
Like I'm just never going to be that person because something's just inherently wrong with me in that way.
Yeah.
And that can breed a lot of shame and hopelessness.
Yeah.
Like if I'm stuck, if I'm fundamentally broken, then
Yeah.
what's the point?
Right.
Whereas now that I've got sort of the tools to recognize, like, okay, that's just untrue.
Yeah.
I'm constantly changing. Yes, like maybe I need to do better in some ways. That doesn't mean that oh, that I'm intrinsically anything.
Hmm.
I find that to be really liberating.
Yeah.
And I find that to be very motivating. All of a sudden now I can, instead of feeling trapped by an idea of myself, I can set that aside and do the things that I want, irrespective of whatever rules I've come up with about who I am.
Yeah. So flexibility, that's one of the gifts of DBT is what I'm hearing, right? Flexibility of self, of choices that you can and choose not to make, and the people you surround yourself with, right? The career choices you get to make, right? It's flexibility.
It is flexibility. You know what? Like when I think about value, like I don't know if but yes, flexibility is like, it is key.
Yeah.
It's funny. We had a TheraHive student that was a physical therapist. And it was so interesting because I talked a lot about what we call cognitive flexibility.
Hmm.
And cognitive flexibility, I think for many of us, it's easy to go through life like looking at the world through a pinhole.
Yeah.
We have all these ideas about what the world is, about who we are, things that we're scared of,
Yeah.
that we don't want,
Yeah.
and our lives can get really small. And a lot of what we're doing in therapy, in DBT and cognitive behavioral therapy, is dilating that pinhole, is
Hmm.
widening our perspective so that we can begin to see the world and engage with it more flexibly. And so I was talking about this in one of the TheraHive groups, and this gentleman was a physical therapist, and he was like, "Oh, he's like, that's what I do as a physical therapist, but with the body."
Mm.
It's like if we, through all sorts of things, if we maintain the same positions over and over again,
Yeah.
body becomes accustomed to it.
Hmm.
And then it's almost like it becomes scared of or too uncomfortable to venture outside that range of motion.
Yeah.
And so always playing with how can we increase the flexibility of the body?
Yeah.
How can we get the body to move in new ways and recognize that there's still going to be some limitations and accept that? But even within those limitations, what does the flexibility look like?
Yeah.
And I think the same exact thing goes with our minds.
Yeah. Totally. I totally agree. I love the physical therapist analogy too, because like just to keep going with that, physical therapy sucks. Like it is not often a most pleasurable experience, and yet the outcome is undeniably fantastic, right? Mobility, flexibility, physical freedom to do things you'd like to do that make your life better. Like I had a shoulder injury in high school and had to do physical therapy, and it was just debilitatingly painful to go in there and move my shoulder an inch, move it 2 inches. But now I have full range of motion and a healthy shoulder that I get to continue to live my life with. So had I stayed rigid and comfortable in like the discomfort, I wouldn't have the freedom to do the things that I want to do. So I love that. I think that's a great metaphor.
It what you also bring up for me right now is how um like there are moments like I have so much, like I have so much fun in the therapy room. Like I find it, I find speaking with someone and working through help, like just the process of delivering DBT is, I think, so exceptionally exciting. Where and sometimes, like the person I'm working with is in a lot of pain, and just like you have this experience, like with the like, you're in physical therapy, you're in a lot of pain, and I imagine myself at that time, like I'm the physical therapist with this gleeful expression, being like, "Oh, how fucking awesome is this? Like
Yeah.
we're gonna get." And there are moments at a time where like I have clients that look at me and be like what are you smiling about? And I'm like, I'm just so excited for you, and they're just
Yeah.
like you're on a fucking different like plane right now.
Yeah.
So it again, I think back to like the judgment, like the non-judgmental piece, like the places where I have skills strengths and some skills deficits. I think my enthusiasm is a skill strength, and I think it reveals a deficit in some ways.
Yes, I love that. I'm sure your clients feel very excited by proxy, or at least at the very least curious. Like, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah, maybe curious is a generous way of putting it.
Well, I'd love to turn the mic over to you, my friend, and if you have any questions for me, I will happily answer them.
I so I think one thing, and I've been thinking a lot about this too, and
Uh-huh.
I want to sort of caution, I guess caution myself or notice my own worry thoughts, like how, waiting, actually, no. Okay, let me, we've talked a little bit about masculinity
Yeah.
and the experience of men.
Hmm.
And I guess from a personal place, how do you see DBT and dialectical thinking
Hmm.
impact your perspective or your experience as a man?
Ooh, great fucking question. I think that prior to DBT, I was swinging from vine to vine of what I thought socially was the best version of a man.
Hmm.
So if, for example, if the context was, um, oh, the guy who doesn't have sex is seen as morally superior, I'm now the guy who doesn't have sex because I'd like to be morally superior in that particular instance, right? Growing up, I'm cringy now to think back to the conversations I was having with my friends about, hey guys, like, abstinence is the way to go, and here's why, explaining it and like trying to argue for it, not being dialectic at all, being very black and white, all or nothing. Like, if you have sex, X, Y, and Z bad things happen, right? Very moralistic. Take me over to college, right? I got a little more flexible, but I'm still in a Christian bubble. I'm still in an evangelical bubble. And so that version of masculinity, while a little more flexible, was still in line with what was the most socially acceptable or encouraged version of masculinity. That being like someone who's zealous, someone who's well spoken, someone who's articulate. Like, as far as Christian circles go, for a second there, I thought I wanted to be a pastor, which honestly would have aligned quite appropriately, given most pastors probably have some form of narcissism, if we're being completely honest. And what drew me to it was being in front of people. And so it's a performance, right? So then as I continued to evolve my masculinity, the problem was that I was never addressing the wounds and the hurts underlying those social choices. So I was still hurting partners, I was still hurting friends, I was still kind of bleeding my own shit on top of other people while trying to keep the mask up of whatever version of masculinity I thought was the most socially acceptable. So, for example, when the Me Too movement happened, the most socially acceptable version of a man was a man hater. So, all of my content was how can I shit on fellow stupid, illiterate, dumb, toxic men and get all of this social clout to then be that version of a man. Meanwhile, in the background, I'm being a horrible partner. I'm being a not so great friend to some people, and I'm being a very challenging son to my parents. Not in dialectical ways, in very, very destructive ways. Now, keeping in context, I had an undiagnosed, very debilitating mental illness. Important context to keep in place. And had I approached any of those things dialectically, none of those things would have played out as they had, right? The abstinence conversation changes from if you have sex, you're a bad person to some people have sex and it's safe and it's okay, and I'm choosing not to because of my personal beliefs. That's different than saying you're a bad person for not having or for having sex. In college, right? Instead of saying, oh, the most valuable person is the person in the front who is leading everybody, saying some people can be in the front and lead, and there's so much effort in the back too, and in the middle and all around. It's a team effort. And then moving forward to the Me Too movement and being a part of that cultural shift, yes. Is it true that so many men like myself are continuing to perpetrate harm on a daily basis? And yes, is it true that their friends are constantly kind of protecting them by not holding them accountable? Absolutely. And if I say that they are not welcome to the table of the conversation, I'm just keeping them in the outskirts. They're just going to keep doing those same behaviors. So that's how DBT has kind of like revolutionized how I think about it. However, I don't think of myself as any sort of rule or exception. The thing with me specifically is that because of, and this is like kind of the beautiful tragedy or irony of the situation is that because I grew up so dogmatic and because I had these emotional vulnerabilities and because I made the choices I made, I'm constantly assuming that I'm the problem. That
Mm,
judgment is what usually comes first. If there is an issue, I'm first saying I must have the biggest role in this pie. What can I do? Now, that's a super unhelpful place to be 99% of the time. However, when you pause and you want to stop causing harm to people around you, it's the best question to ask. Now,
mm,
it just inadvertently happened to lead me to DBT. I consider myself in inspirationally lucky, right? I just happened to get into a hospital and I just happened to be with a therapist at the time that I was hospitalized who recognized that I had BPD. The hospital wanted to diagnose bipolar. They were like
mm,
gung ho on bipolar or non-specified mood disorder, which was very
mm,
frustrating. And so sitting down with that therapist, she sat down with me and we went through the DSM together. We went through my history together. And to both of us, it was like, yeah, it's pretty fucking clear where we're at here. Because of her, I got into a free DBT clinic to start the process. However, after that, I got a job and I no longer qualified for the DBT program through Los Angeles Healthcare. And so I spent the next 3 months fighting insurance to get into a private clinic. I just happened to get into a private clinic that is super eclectic, that they are so on their shit. It's the DBT Center of Orange County, if you're familiar
mm,
with them. Um, you know, all the people over there are amazing. And so I just happened to get land at a clinic that was incredibly well funded. The disparity between the free experience and the private experience is a chasm. It's not even close. And they were so disciplined in how they modeled every single skill that even when I'm leading groups, I'm thinking of my DBT team, my leaders in my groups. I'm thinking of how they would how I felt when they responded with validation, how I
mm.
felt when they responded with curiosity, what it felt like to watch them gently correct somebody out of a black or white thought into a more dialectical thought. Um, so yeah, all of that to say, like all of those experiences now inform my kind of revised mission, which is if the problem is men are perpetrating the majority of these violent crimes and the solutions aren't working, whatever it may be, anger management, substance abuse management, in my opinion, like less helpful models like the Duluth model, then is there something better out there? That was the question Marcia asked when she had her diagnosis. Like, is there something better out there that exists? I think it already exists. I think DBT is and could be the best option for most men to just get the ball rolling, to just
Mm,
be in a non-judgmental. Because what does most violence stem from? Most violence stems from shame, and most shame comes from self-judgment. And if I'm a man and I come into a space and I've done something horrible, like socially, I'm very ashamed of it, and the first thing you lead with is you should feel bad about the thing you did. I I don't need you to tell me that I'm there. If I come into a space and you say, you did a bad thing and you're not a bad person, or you did a thing that you can be ashamed of because it's against your values, and there's like a clear path away from it, that's a vastly different experience that is not specific to me. That's just a human experience, right? So I think to your, I may have answered your question. I'm not entirely sure. To your question, it constantly is informing my experience with masculinity because I'm also just hyper aware that I'm 31. Like I'm a baby. Like I'm very well aware that like there's still so much to learn and understand. And so, yeah, I just keep my like I have I have a little note next to my desk that has like a list of things to remember why I'm doing what I'm doing and why I'm going the places I'm going. I'm not going to say them out loud because they're very personal to me. I tell you when we're not recording, but they sit in front of me so I remember like what the fuck am I doing here? Like what the fuck is the point of this shit? And because I have such a intense s- still working through identity disturbance, it's helpful to come back to the dialectics of like I can not know who I am now and discover who I am as I'm doing it. So, yeah, did I answer your question?
You did, and I think uh, so. I'm gonna say something back to you and tell me if this sort of resonates. Like there's a dialectical tension I'm observing, which is on the one hand, when we hold too tightly
Hmm.
to any given identity,
Hmm.
like ideas of masculinity,
Yeah.
even the identity that I could have of like quote unquote being a good therapist.
Yeah.
If we hold too tightly to any one of those identities, pain is likely to result
Hmm.
because none of like one, we're all changing and growing. We are likely to never meet whatever criteria is that we imagine.
Yeah.
So we're likely to feel just constant self disappointment and recrimination like, oh, I'm not a good enough man. I'm not a
Yeah.
good enough.
Yeah.
Even the idea of being a good person, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you sort of identify this other experience, which is so it's like identity at one end, but then no identity at the other end,
Yeah.
which also seems really painful
Yeah.
because at that point, it's like, well, who am I? What's important to me?
Yeah.
And I can imagine like living in either place feels like an impossibility or just feels very painful.
Very painful.
Like on the no identity end, just emptiness.
Yeah.
At the wanting to inhabit the full identity, shame and frustration.
Yeah.
And I sort of wonder, like in your experience, one, do you resonate with that tension? And two, how have you navigated it thus far in your life?
Great. That's a great fucking question. So the in the past, I would say, because at this point I kind of view my life not necessarily in a perfect binary, but a blurred before BPD, DBT, after BPD, DBT. Just
Mhm.
because there was so much unknown that was happening. Like the constant thought I was having before the diagnosis was, what is wrong with me? Something is wrong with me. Like I had enough cognizance to know that like these behaviors aren't normal, the choices I'm making aren't consistent, or they're quote unquote like crazy. Like why would you do that kind of a decision? So there was a constant feeling of, what is wrong with me? And then at the same time, throughout that entire journey, I was believing that my whole identity had to be around belief in Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior.
Mhm.
So there's this constant tension of like, why are you feeling like you don't have an identity? You literally have an identity in Jesus Christ. Again, you're the problem. You're not believing hard enough. You're not reading enough. You're not doing enough. Here it is. Whereas now, even like, I love the earlier you said, like when someone's like, I'm gonna write a book, and they're like, "Ah, I'm not gonna do that. I'm very much in the past, I've been that person. Like, I'm gonna write a book. It's like, sure, bro. Well, when I see the final draft, I'll believe you. The thing is, like, in the past, it would have been, oh, I didn't write the book. Oh, I suck. I'm just not going to be a writer. Whereas now it's like, oh, I didn't write that book. Well, why not? What was going on around that time? And can I still do something different? Sure. And so for a while there, I was writing short stories. I have a podcast, Short Stories with Stefan, where like, that it was just an outlet for me. Whereas now, as I continue to navigate it, I think I'm very open to the possibility that my masculinity will continue to evolve. And that if I continue to just kind of like to your point, like go towards the things that are building my life worth living versus like staying away from the things that or yeah, going away from the things that don't get me to my life worth living goals, it remains helpful. Like I'm trying to think of like a specific example. Oh, here's a great example, right? So like I will have conversations with people about like, the the powder keg issue this last election was transgenderism. What is transgenderism? What does it look like? And I realized I kept running into people who had opinions about transgender people who have never met a transgender person. And so I was like, well, where does that show up in my life? Who are the people that I have opinions about that I've never met? And there was quite a few. So it was like I said, like it's like a painful tension of, oh, okay, I'm not a bad person for not knowing this. And now that I know it, I can go and do something about it if I want to. And as far as like navigating this next phase or whatever it may be, I- I think I'm still figuring out that specifics because I'm also in a seasons of like adjusting relationships and I lost some friendships recently. And so like that impacts your understanding of who I am and who I want to be, right? Like what led to that friendship going downhill and what led to me choosing not to try and reignite it essentially. And then what does that mean moving forward? Who do I want in my life moving forward after this experience? Like to me, all of that sits within kind of the ever evolving circle of like, well, who am I essentially?
I I think one thing that comes up as you were speaking is the way that shame at times has been weaponized.
Oh yeah.
Um, and I want to recognize I well, it's I don't know, just shame is such a powerful it is just such a powerful emotion
Hmm.
that people people in authority can use
Yeah.
to really silence folks. I guess that's to some extent what the function of shame is, like get in line.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, that was one thought that came up. I think the other thing that comes up for me as you were talking um is again this idea of flexibility, where a recognition that you know you're no longer sort of holding on tightly to this experience of like one identity, or
Yeah.
like this is like and at the same time and you were sort of describing this, it's almost like this swing, like the moment you don't feel like you're living up to this,
Yeah.
then you experience the emptiness and it's like
Right.
I'm nothing.
Yeah.
And then you're like, but wait, I gotta be something. So then you jump back over here.
Yep.
And it's this sort of ping-ponging between the two, which I can imagine is so exhausting and so painful.
Yes.
It sounds to me like the way that you've sort of short-circuited that is by at once sort of really asking yourself, like in your wise mind, what it is that you want,
Right.
rather than trying to perform or achieve some sort of ideal, and to flexibly hold that thing that you want rather than rigidly pursue it. Be like, yeah, this is all evolving. Like, this
Yes.
is what I want right now. I'm moving towards it, and this can change.
Yes. Yes. And I think for so long that was seen as like a negative personality trait. Like, oh, you just like who are you? Like stick to one thing. Like why can't you? That's my issue with social media is that like the algorithms want you to find your lane and stay in it. And it's just not how my brain operates. Like, I'm not going to be the DBT guy forever. That's just simply not possible. I'm going to say something that's going to probably piss off my audience, or I'm going to do something that's in contradiction to their perception of that person online. Like, I'm not a whole person online. I'm a character. I'm a part of something. It's not me, Stefan Vandenkoy, fully present with you, doing life with you, experiencing you in person. It's a version of me that I'm so happy and willing to present because it's helpful to some people. And I'm very much not attached to that person. He is just an online person. And that's the challenge is like, how do I mindfully navigate that space in a way that I'm not self-destructing, right? Because in the past, when we jumped back and forth, like what you were saying, in the past, each jump was kind of a self-destruct button. So, oh, we're over-identifying with this. Let's blow up my life and everything in it so we can be nothing. And now that we're nothing, wait, I'm nothing. I don't believe in anything. I have no identity. Let's blow up my life so we can go be this thing. Whereas now with the dialectics, it's like how do I mindfully ask for what I want? How do I mindfully check in with myself and my own values and what is shifting and what's not shifting? The big thing that I've been learning in therapy is trying to understand what values are mine intrinsically and what were indoctrinated into me that
Mm.
I'm still uncovering and unlearning because some just like a I think of like trauma as emotional herpes to a certain extent because it's always with me and every now and again it gets flared up and it's not and sometimes I don't know what it is that caused that flare up and it just like takes a moment of and I used herpes as an example because it's like there's so much shame around STIs and it's like why if we're all going to have sex and some people aren't going to be protected during sex like this is just a natural byproduct of human pleasure and
Yeah,
creativity and risk
yeah,
and same with shame, right? Like if I am going to pause and be like, oh my God, like, ah, like where did that come from? If my next reaction is like, you should feel bad about that feeling and how you reacted because of it, where the fuck am I supposed to go with that? Instead of pausing, right, giving myself the space, validating myself. Another superpower that DBT brought into my life was validate, validate, validate. I read Alan Frazzetti's book, High Conflict Couples, like right after I finished my DBT program, just to like keep the ball going. And that book is literally just like how to validate 101. And
yeah,
but it's so powerful because the first thought that I'm often having is to invalidate the thought, like, or the
yeah,
feeling, or the emotion. And to our conversation about masculinity, I think that's the default. So if I'm going to have an emotion that's uncomfortable, I'm just going to invalidate it until I get to the emotion that's meant for me as a man. If I'm feeling like my stomach hurts, but I am not going to express that feeling of my stomach hurting because my wife's uterus is falling out, that is me suppressing and invalidating my stomach pain instead of holding the tension of the dialectics and saying, yes, my wife, my partner is in severe agony and pain, and I am suffering. How can we both help each other? Instead of doing like I'm just going to shut down and not feel anything, and also not go to the doctor, and also not live as long because I'm not going to go to the doctor. That's some binary bullshit.
yeah.
So,
That is,
yeah.
uh, I appreciate you. I appreciate this conversation.
Yeah, is anything coming up that I'm missing? That's my other favorite question to ask. Like, am I saying something that maybe I'm not hearing, or maybe between the lines that I'm not hearing that you're noticing?
I love that question. I mean, that's one of the other, when we're trying to look for synthesis, like what is it that we're missing in this conversation? What is it that we're leaving out?
That's my favorite question to ask my therapist. I say, I talk, I talk, I talk, and I go, what did you hear me say? And then I go, what am I missing?
That's my favorite question to ask my clients is what is it that we're missing?
Yeah.
Uh, what is it that we're missing? I don't know. I think that I it could be said that like our like, the way that we're talking about identity is, in like we are two cis white men. So I imagine that we are missing something when we
Mhm.
talk about identity in that respect. Um, I'm trying to think if there's something that we are nothing. I mean, of course, we're missing something as there are an infinite number of truths,
Totally.
but nothing is coming up right now.
What would be if you could snap your fingers, right? Like,
Yeah.
boom, and now this has happened. How would you address, some call it a masculinity crisis, others just call it like a current cultural moment. How would you address what we're seeing still nationwide, like despite the progress that we see in a lot of other areas, despite the tolerance that has now become commonplace in places like parts of California, parts of the West Coast, parts of the East Coast, popping up here or there, despite all of these things, still seeing a record number of men committing suicide, still seeing a record number of men on chat boards basically spouting out misogyny, right? The manosphere is not shrinking, it's only getting bigger. And I think that the lie that kind of was perpetrated after some of the more public canceling of people was that, oh, well, if we cancel them, they go away. It's like,
Yeah.
no, just like everything else, if it's not in the light, it's in the dark. And if it's in the
Yes.
dark, it's gonna grow differently than if it was in the light. And so I'm wondering like what would be Jesse's magic bullet
To do this.
to do this?
I think echoing a lot of what you said, which is that shame is really an ineffective weapon.
Hmm.
Um, in that the moment we communicate to people that who they are is fundamentally wrong or bad,
Hmm.
it while it may feel really validating and it may
Yeah.
feel really righteous, the long-term consequence is oftentimes shame is then met with anger, like followed by anger and
Yeah.
resentment.
Yeah.
And so I do think, you know, educating folks on validation, educating folks on non-judgment, educating folks on dialectics. I think those are all powerful things. And I mean, I hate to come back, like I don't know, man, like capitalism, it's a real bummer. It's like, how do you distribute these things? I mean, one of the things that I really am proud of with TheraHive is that we are trying to disseminate
Yeah.
these skills as rather than just like throwing out skills, like we want to educate others who will then educate others,
Yeah.
have that sort of multiply effect.
Yeah.
Um, but it makes it really hard to educate people, in particular men, on how to be with their emotions
Yeah.
when there aren't a lot of financial incentives to help make that happen.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good point. And that's why I think that the social incentive needs to be stronger. Like there needs to be more social incentive for men to engage with their emotions without there being this like insane backlash of consequences. Like,
Like, I just like it is hard to get any like I completely agree, and I think and I love what you have described as a goal for yourself to help men do this.
yeah.
It's really fucking hard because people emotions being with emotions is one of the bravest, most challenging thing that we can ask a person to do.
Yeah, I
And they're really
know.
scared of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. And if like if you could frame it
Yeah.
as the bravest thing, as the strongest thing, as a masculine thing, then I think there is room for at least curiosity. I think also people are just open. I think people maybe are more open to emotional availability in smaller groups. So I think
Yeah.
it's challenging to like be scrolling on YouTube and then somebody, say somebody who ascribes to certain manosphere ideologies comes across one of my videos, God knows how. Actually, probably in like I have certain people online that will make fun of my videos. I'm always flattered. I'm like, hey, you took time out of your day to make fun of me. All right, well, I'm on your
I don't
mind.
even know what the manosphere is.
Oh, you don't know what the manosphere is? So the manosphere is basically a sect of masculine thinking that
Yeah.
is misogynistic. So we have you've heard of incels, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I've heard of incels.
So involuntary celibates are a part of the manosphere. MGTOW, men going their own way. Have you heard of men going their own way?
Oh,
It's a group of men who have decided that they are just not going to live by society's rules. They're going to be abstinent and they're going to just work on their fitness and be basically nomads, like alone, stoic, by themselves. They're not gonna participate in the world.
God, I
Then
gotta tell you, like it's like gosh, yeah, men are in trouble.
and then there's pickup artists, right? So there's a whole culture
Yes,
of
yes, I'm familiar
pickup
with the pickup.
artists. I'm sure you've heard of negging, right? That's one of the many tactics
Yes,
that
yes, the negging.
And then there's the most one that's catching steam right now is stoicism. And stoicism has been within the
Yeah.
manosphere for quite some time, but now it's like hitting the mainstream and people are like, Marcus Aurelius was a stoic. It's like he also raised one of the most destructive Caesars in the history of Rome. So maybe we shouldn't be always, attributing things.
Um, yeah.
There's a
Wow.
really, really, really good book on the manosphere and the dangers that it poses on just young boys in particular. It's called Men Who Hate Women, and the author goes into detail. She went into kind of these spaces to try and get to do research and ended up, you know, it impacted her quite immensely because of the threats that she got and the people that she encountered and she
Oh,
experienced. So the challenge is that like when some of those groups were coming to light, like when the Proud Boys were being talked about, when some of these more kind of intense misogynistic groups were being talked about, they were being talked about in a way that was very demeaning and shaming. I participated in it. I remember saying like, how stupid do you have to be to think that this is the best like way to live or whatever? Like, or like how small-minded, like, oh, these people are just so stupid. Instead of being like what would the dialectics tell me? The dialectics would tell me there is some truth in what they're experiencing, which is that they're saying, I don't feel powerful, I don't feel important, I don't feel valued, and I want some agency, right? The method they're choosing to get those things are ironically the opposite of those things. They
it's
they
the only
lead
thing
them,
like, yeah.
yeah, they lead them away from it. So, but I really do think it's because somebody hasn't just in a way that makes sense to these individuals we're referencing invited them with no strings attached. Like,
I
hey,
have to tell you, I like, God bless. Like, I like when you say this to me, like my urge is to be like, yeah, like fuck those guys.
yeah,
Like my urge is to be like, yeah, I don't want to, I don't, and I think to your point, the effective thing is to engage. And
yeah.
I'm gonna leave that up to you.
No, you bring up a really good point, which is, after 2016 and after our most recent election, a lot of people, a lot of minorities felt that they don't, like, what am I supposed to do now? Like, I don't have the energy. Like, all of the intersection of my life has now reached an impasse where I am in danger of being like seen as valid, being seen as a member of society. And
Yeah,
I realized this most recent election that like if I took a position of apathy, my life really wouldn't be too affected at all
yeah,
by either the policies because I live in California or by some of the social impacts because I present as so white passing. Like I'm
yeah,
Dutch Rican, like I'm half Puerto Rican, like there's a lot of Hispanic in here, but I can get through life being Vandencoy.
yeah.
That means that I have an excess amount of energy that's not being spent on defending my identity. I have an excess amount of energy that can be spent reaching out to people. So like
I
to your
think I really I think it's incredible. Like I really like I
oh, thanks,
appreciate that
Jesse.
you are holding the dialectic. Um yeah. I it
Well, and to be completely transparent, it is entirely because of my own personal experiences. Like I watched what men who like I personally watched fathers do things that are abhorrent. I personally watched grandfathers do things that were abhorrent. I myself participated in incredibly harmful behaviors in like crossing lines that you go, oh, I would never do that. And then when you do, you have an identity crisis like, well, I must be a total piece of shit monster. It's like, no, you
yeah,
didn't have the skills. You didn't have any of the effective skills that you have now. And the internal dialogue you were having with yourself was just destructive, destructive. And when you're thinking destructive thoughts and you're self-destructing constantly, there is absolutely no room to have love, connection, transparency, dialogue, dialectics with the people around you. Like inadvertently, you're just going to be, for lack of better judgment, shitty.
I I'm I'm sold. I'm sold. I'm so sold. Sign me up. This is great. I've noticed my judgments. I am, if, you got to live by the non-judgmental. It's funny. It's like I started off talking about how I'm a non-judgmental person, and then you're talking about Proud Boys, and I'm like, fuck it. And it's like, all behavior is caused.
Yeah,
All behavior is caused.
yeah.
Everything is
It's
exactly as it should be based on all the things that happened before it.
and I actively am cautious about how much privilege comes from being able to go, hey, you know what? I think I'm going to hold space for these people because they have not directly hurt me. Like I have had a very limited experience of seeing somebody who traumatized me in like a public space and everybody is like engaging with them and you're like, stop engaging with this person. Like they're dangerous. They hurt me. So limited experience. So imagine being someone who was in an abusive relationship for 15, 20, 25 years and then hearing me go, I think I'm going to give these guys some empathy and some compassion and not lead with shame. I think it'd be very valid to be like, fuck you, fuck that, and like they can go fuck themselves. And I'm not going to say one way or the other whether or not that's effective because that's literally, I haven't survived what you've survived. I've only survived what I've survived. And if in my survival, I can essentially like, there's lots of ways to tame a tiger. I think the least effective way to tame a tiger is to kill it, unless that tiger is unwilling to do anything remotely recognizable in the realm of change.
Definitely.
I personally don't think there are very many people, or as many people as we have been led to believe, who are that rigid and unwilling to change.
But listen, as we talked about, change is the only constant. I in what you just held, like the like I think you got it. I think I'm fully on board. I think this is great. I think you are like, yeah, I'm in it. I'm in it.
Yeah, I
Whatever I
would.
can do to help. Um, it's been such a pleasure speaking.
Thank you for taking the time, Jesse. I'm very grateful that we could find the time for this.
Yeah, I appreciate your flexibility.
Well, where can we find you? My people who are
You
going to
can
watch
find
this?
me. Talk is good is my Instagram. Talkgood.org is my website. TheraHive. I'm coming out with a book soon with my mentor Shereen Rizvi. It's going to
What?
be about DBT skills more accessible for
Yes,
folks.
I love
That'll be
that.
exciting.
And
But
then just before we sign
yeah,
off, a final thought for the audience, something you want to leave them with that they can hold on to.
you can change. You can change. Nothing's permanent. None of us is any intrinsically one thing. We're all constantly changing.
I love it. Bye bye, everybody.